Okay. We all set, Deanne? Okay, great. Sorry, we were just setting up the recorder. Okay, so as I was saying, please enter any questions you have in the chat window, but if you have something with a technical problem, that's more what I'm referring to. If you have general questions about something that I'm saying, if it's possible to hold it till the end, we will have a Q&A at the end of the webinar, still just in time to wrap up at the end. So. So there's Diani masquerading as Asia. Okay, so here we go. Figuring out what to do first can be overwhelming, but in order to have a cohesive program, you will need a plan. We will touch on a lot of subjects today, from what exactly is digitization, why it's important, how you can implement it at your institution, and we will also be discussing hardware, software, different formats, and long-term management. So first, I would like to just quickly define these two terms, which sometimes get used interchangeably, but they are actually quite different. Digitization versus digital preservation. Digitization, according to the federal agency's Digitization Guidelines Initiative, or known as FAGI, digitization is the process of recording an analog signal in digital form, commonly for increased access or for preservation purposes. In other words, digitization is converting data or an image into something digital, such as scanning or photographing. Digital preservation, on the other hand, here's the definition according to the American Library Association, it combines policies, strategies, and actions to ensure access to reformatted and born digital content regardless of the challenges of media failure and technological change. The goal of digital preservation is the accurate rendering of authenticated content over time. It's really important to understand the difference between them. One is a means to an end, so using the physical object along with hardware to produce the digital image, which would then be the actual digitization, and the other is a long-term commitment. Digital preservation, it's a way of ensuring long-lasting access through policy development and an institution's dedication to preserving the content into the future. This requires active management over time, and also a commitment from staff to keep these policies updated. For the purpose of this webinar, though, we will predominantly be discussing digitization factors and planning, but next I want to touch briefly on digital preservation policies. A well-defined digital preservation policy is essential in order for any institution to carry out its mission to preserve digital content. The goal is to cultivate a long-term repository for our digital materials and to better serve the shared objective to preserve digital content. A policy will depict the need and methodologies for protecting the digital content. These preservation accomplishments will guarantee that faculty, staff, researchers, students, visitors, and any additional users will have continuing access to the growing digital resources at your institution. This policy will lay out and define things such as the purpose, why you want to preserve your digital assets, any goals and objectives of your institution, any challenges your institution may face, such as identifying changes in media or equipment, or costs associated with digital preservation, or maintaining collaborative relationships. Best practices for making this content available. Stakeholders, who exactly will be involved in the process. And defining the scope of your collection and content types. Not only is a good policy a great way to lay out the methods for protecting and preserving collections, it's also a great tool to obtain funding for collections care, digital preservation upkeep and management, and for inclusion in grant applications. When designing a digital imaging project, a plan is a must. Before you start any digitization, you need to ask some basic questions. Why are you digitizing? Who is your audience? Who else needs to be involved? For instance, who are the key staff or collaborators outside of your institution? What should you digitize? In other words, how do you decide what criteria to use in order to select the materials? Are you scanning for preservation purposes? How about copyright issues? Or software, hardware, best practices? Will it be in-house or outsourced? How will you manage and deliver these files? It's so important to ask your institution these questions before jumping into a digitization program. We'll be going over these today. So you've decided you want to digitize, but why? The use of technology has become a core part of any institution's mission. It's important to figure out exactly why you want to digitize and have a plan. There are several general reasons that institutions or individuals may want to digitize their materials or collections. These are just a few of the reasons. Access or outreach in order to reach a broad range of users. Preservation to protect the original and reduce handling. And storage needs, allowing you to free up space. I'm going to go into a few more specifics of each to explain their advantages. The primary and usually the most obvious advantage of digitization is that it enables greater access to collections of all types. All manner of material can be digitized and delivered in electronic form. Digital materials can be made available to a broader audience than those who have the resources or ability to travel to see the analog collections. People can simultaneously view or use the same document from multiple locations. Audiences can access collections for often unanticipated and broad-ranging research interests. An example might be historical materials may be used for local history or genealogical research. It's possible to search, browse, and compare materials in useful and creative ways. Patrons can browse through thumbnails of materials and image catalogs, including images of materials that were previously inaccessible, such as glass plate negatives or oversized or fragile materials. Digitization may also promote outreach to professors, research institutes, scholarly communities, as well as sharing photos on social media platforms. Preservation is another common motivation for digitizing. Developing a digital surrogate of a rare or fragile original object can provide access to users while preventing the original from damage by handling or display, since often the fragile condition of collections prevents their use. Digitization assists in keeping original materials secure, as the originals will not need to be handled as often. So though digitization is not yet a preservation medium, it definitely has a preservation component. It's excellent for minimizing wear and tear on the original. It's preferred for paper-based materials, and it's widely embraced by scholars over microfilm. Some drawbacks though: media obsolescence concerns. Records may need to be reformatted and copied to new supported technologies that are more commonplace in the future. Eventually, we will progress by developing and refining different techniques for preserving different digital formats, but that's what it is for now. Another concern: costs. You do not want to waste that money by creating digital objects that can't be preserved, so the goal is to create the best quality digital images possible. Ultimately, providing access to digital copies does enable the user to reduce the use of fragile materials. So in that sense, digitization is a kind of preservation. The third big advantage of digitization is storage. Many organizations still depend on paper-based record keeping, and there are a lot of challenges with that. Lack of storage space. Collections may require a significant amount of space to store, and that only gets bigger as the amount of documents grow over time. Paper records need to be stored close at hand for quick access, which is not always practical. Materials may be prone to damage. Over time, paper quality deteriorates. Natural disasters can happen. It can happen anywhere: a flood, a storm, an earthquake, God forbid. Document vulnerability. Loss of any critical document of value causes a serious problem. Also, the possibility of a confidential document being accessed by unwanted or unauthorized people who may even tamper with it or steal it. And costs. There can be numerable costs, such as storing, shelving, retrieving and cataloging the collections or materials, the cost of building libraries, the cost of power for heat, light, air conditioning, all of which are direct costs to the institution or the individual. Next, we will go over your audience and workflow. So who is your audience? Who will use these images and benefit from your digitization project? Some materials can and will be used by a variety of people, but they will use these images differently. Narrowing your audience will help you make some decisions. How do you identify your audience? Is it someone from a cultural organization or a general user, perhaps students, researchers and scholars, maybe genealogists or people in the business community or universities? A great goal is to make things available that both scholars and a broader audience will find interesting. Knowing your users will help you determine what materials you select, the software and resolution needs of the scans, what kind of equipment you need and what kind of hardware, what kind of software, technical and metadata choices you will need to make. How will these digital reproductions of the object be used? Publications or school projects? Do they need to print resources out? Are they web-based or for a specific class? Depending how the materials will be used will impact how you design and plan your digitization project. You also need to define roles and responsibilities of various staff and stakeholders, people who will be accountable or responsible for particular digital imaging or preservation strategies. In-house staff, building skills for them to be able to contribute to a project. Project staff, will you be hiring or reassigning staff for this? Technical support, you should become allies with your IT department. Are there partners outside of your organization, your consortium or your network? Are there area experts you want to reach out to? Volunteers, such as local history groups or local experts or genealogists in the area. Collaborative efforts involving 2 or more organizations can sometimes help to draw grant funding. Are there any potential funders you want to reach out to, or users or patrons? These are the individuals that are supportive of your digitization or digital preservation efforts and can help drive the process. Based on how much material you have and what preservation actions you're taking, or in other words, based on what needs to be done, you will need staff to fill the following functions: selection and research of materials, scanning, creating metadata, file management and backups, quality control, website design and technical support, and project management. Sometimes digital imaging projects will involve staff beyond those specifically assigned to the project. Some additional skills you may need to consider are conservation treatment, photographic skills and techniques, database administration, and computer programming. It's also important when starting any digital imaging initiative, consider managerial issues. Among some responsibilities that fall to project managers are setting realistic timelines, objectives, and expectations of the project, determining the best approach for accomplishing project goals, developing and defending budgets, facilitating communication among project participants, including outside vendors, monitoring production, which includes quality and costs, and looking beyond the project's end. Next, we'll talk a little bit about the selection of materials, and we'll touch briefly on copyright. How do you decide what to digitize? It's important to establish and define the criteria to help you prioritize what you will be digitizing. This list is just some of the criteria that can affect the selection of materials for digitization. This criteria should be used to evaluate which collections you want to consider first, depending on the degree of emphasis on access and preservation goals, and it may be based on a number of factors. The source's physical condition. For those items that are rare, unique, fragile, you need to decide, is it safe to digitize them without damaging the originals? Some collection items may need minimal conservation treatment or stabilization by trained conservators before they can be safely transported, handled, or digitized. Items in poor condition due to damage or fragility are often candidates for digital reformatting. The selection of material will almost always be content-driven. Digitization can offer significant added value both in terms of access and functionality. Uniqueness. How rare is the item? Demand. Original materials that are in high demand are strong candidates for digital reformatting. Accessibility. As we talked about, to improve access and outreach, it's one of the most important goals for any institution. And then also consider the cultural significance, the audience, and the mission of your institution. This is a sample collections matrix that I wanted to include that you can use to rate various collections. You can use this to prioritize them based on all of these different variables like we just discussed. And you can create one like this to help you rank those materials that are most important to you. And this one in particular has things such as publications, diaries, oral histories, periodicals, but you can customize it for your own use. So please feel free. And you will be getting a recording of this afterwards, so you will get all of these slides later at a later time. There are also some materials that you may choose not to digitize for a variety of reasons. Some require more involved and expensive repair or are so fragile that they cannot easily be stabilized. So for these items, preservation specialists must discuss treatment options with the curator or conservator or project manager of the collection. And here again is a slide that you can refer to later of materials that you may want to exclude from digitizing. And this was taken from the Library of Congress website, and I'll just touch on a few of them here. You may want to exclude items where the paper is extremely acidic, fragile, brittle, paper that has iron gall ink that's eating into the page, books with severe leather deterioration or red rot, photographs that are curled or creased or cracked, deteriorated cellulose nitrate film negatives or positives, and scrolls or non-traditional text or image formats. So again, it's just a small list, but it's a great tool to have and to refer to later on. So as I mentioned, I did want to touch on copyright, but just briefly. This is extremely important. Just because it's in your collection, it does not mean that you are allowed to do whatever you want with it. So how do you know if you have the right to reformat or distribute it? Before you digitize, you will need to make an effort to track down the copyright. These are some things to consider. Does your institution own the copyright or have permission to distribute? Again, just because you own it doesn't mean you have the copyright. So if you don't know, you need to find out. Does the donor hold the rights? If so, you'll need to contact them. Do you have clear documentation of gifts? This is a really good time to review or revisit your deed of gift if you need to modify the agreement to include rights or permissions to publish. Here's a great list of resources. It's a nice comprehensive list, again, for you to refer to later. Next, I will touch on quality control. We'll talk about best practices, different tools, formats, and metadata. All institutions need to adhere to current industry standards and best practices, especially as it relates to selection, acquisition, upkeep, and the distribution of your digital assets and content. and that includes the accompanying metadata as well. The content needs to remain meaningful and readable. So I'm going to go over the next couple of slides, the BESSER principles. Howard Besser, a scholar of digital preservation from UCLA and NYU, has been working on digitization projects for nearly 20 years. So I want to just go over some of these principles. We are going to go a little more in depth on some of these as we go along today, but just wanted to briefly go through this. Scan or capture at the highest resolution appropriate to the informational content of the originals. But remember, higher resolution means larger files, so more storage. Resolution will change depending on the type of material you are digitizing. Scan at an appropriate level of quality. This is to avoid rescanning and rehandling the originals in the future. So really try to scan once. It's a good idea to practice with non-fragile items to start. Create and store a master file that can be used to produce derivative image files and serve a variety of current and future user needs. And you will need high quality derivatives as well. And we're going to discuss this in greater detail in a bit. Use system components that are non-proprietary. Those are much easier to migrate and revise in the future. Use image file formats and compression techniques that will conform to industry standards. And again, we're going to be going over these in a bit as well. Create backup copies of all files on a stable medium. The more you can, the better. Store backups in climate-controlled areas and one off-site if possible. Use high-quality hard drives or a server, and make sure you do backups and have refreshing strategies in place. Create meaningful metadata for image files or collections. And again, we're going to go over this in a little while. Store all media in an appropriate environment. Monitor and recopy data as necessary. It's good to perform quality control on backups. Without this, they may be worthless in the future. Outline a migration strategy for transferring data across generations of technology. And this is something that could be defined in your digital preservation policy if you were to have one. Anticipate and plan for future technological developments. Migration and preservation strategies can be difficult. I included this resource, even though it refers in the title anyway, specifically for rare book and manuscript collections. It's actually a great introduction to designing any digitization project. It asks, if you go to that link at the bottom there, it will take you through a series of basic questions to help you define goals and resources, much like what we've already talked about, such as what is the vision of the project, who should be involved, what you want to digitize and why, and how you'd incorporate quality management for the project. So I think it's a really good read, and it's an easy read and a good tool. And speaking of tools, some more resources for you. There are a lot out there to help guide you, to keep you within the best standards and practices when you're doing digitization. And these are wonderful resources. They'll address all types of topics such as technical overviews, capture specs, hardware, software, metadata, copyright, workflow. There's file naming information, storage, and a number of other considerations. So again, a really great tool here. And these are some standards organizations compiled from the Library of Congress that you should also have on hand, so you can refer to these as well. So at this point, we've looked at some of the big picture issues before making the commitment to digitize your collections. But now I really want to focus on the more technical aspects of digitization. And we'll start with the absolute basics. Digitization technologies allow us to control the bit depth, the resolution, size, color, and other qualities that will affect how the image appears on a computer screen or how it is output to a printer. So I want to talk about these three elements: pixels, bit depth, and resolution. When you scan a photo or document, the scanning device creates a digital image consisting of tens of thousands and sometimes millions of different colored tiny dots called pixels or picture elements. These little dots make up the images you see on the computer. Normally you don't see the individual pixels because they're so small, which is good because most people want to look at smooth images rather than pixelated ones, but the dimensions of a digital image are expressed in terms of its pixels. They are the smallest physical element of a digital display device that the eye can discern. So if you were to zoom in close on any photograph on your computer screen, you'll see them, rows and rows of tiny little squares. And the dimensions of a photo or of an image you may have seen is expressed in terms of pixels. So 800 by 600 or 1520 by 1280. These are all pixels, 800 pixels by 600 pixels, etc. And digitizing is not limited to text or images. I know we've only talked about that so far. You can also digitize audio and video, but in this webinar we are just going to be discussing documents and photos. Bit depth is a measurement of the number of bits or data or number of colors per pixel. The more bits per pixel or bit depth, the more information the pixel contains, and this means better quality. So black and white is called bit tonal, which is 1 bit per pixel. It only contains 2 colors, black and white, and it's a monochromatic image. The most common setting for a grayscale image is 8 bits per pixel, which ultimately yields about 256 shades of gray. And the most common setting for color is 24 bits per pixel, which yields about 16.7 million color tones. Some scanners actually also do 16-bit grayscale and 48-bit color, quite a bit higher. With more bits per pixel, you have more to work with if you're going to be editing the photo, but this also increases your data and the file size. Here's an example of the differences between the different bit depths. You can clearly see that the higher the bit depth, the better the quality. The next element I'd like to talk about is resolution. Resolution is determined by the number of pixels used to present an image. It is expressed in dots per inch, or DPI, which usually refers to the number of dots of ink in a printed inch, or pixels per inch, PPI, which usually refers to the pixel density of on-screen images. In either case, they are both a measurement of pixel density. Commercial scanners generally use the term DPI, so you may be more familiar with DPI. The more pixels or dots you have in a 1-inch square space, the more detail an image can hold. So increasing the number of pixels used to capture an image will result in a higher resolution and a capture of finer detail. But just FYI, more DPI is not always better, as you can only scan so much detail at one time. Beyond that limited amount of detail, more DPI cannot actually add anything of value, but it will just make your file sizes enormous for no reason. So there are optimum settings for different photo sizes and types. For snapshot prints and common enlargement, such as 4x6, 5x7, 8x10, recommend 300 to 400 DPI. For small prints or slides, you need about 1400 to 1500 DPI. Since they are so small and hold a lot of detail in this small area, again, you need to capture more dots per inch in order to obtain more detail. If you want a close-up, such as an enlargement of a face in a crowd, you'd increase the DPI in order to get the size you want. But keep in mind, the quality may not be as good once you've changed the DPI. Negatives should be around 1500 to 2000 dpi, again, since they hold a lot of detail, like slides. And remember, again, increasing the DPI will always increase the file size because you're adding more data to the file. So when you're choosing resolution and bit depth, remember your overall project mission and audience, and this will help you select the proper specifications. These are two excellent resources for more specific technical details. The first is from the ALA, which has a great minimum capture guidelines section. It breaks down every type of source content, so video will be in there, audio, literally any type of content you can imagine, they've got it in there. So it's a really great minimum capture guidelines, the best I've seen of all of these resources as far as that goes. And then the Cornell link is a really great overall tool and tutorial, anything from your basic terminology to project management. So these are two I highly recommend. So once you've captured, the digital image can be saved in numerous file formats that may or may not include compression technologies that will reduce the size of the file. Your scanner software will save your scans as a digital file in a format that you choose. The ones we're going to focus on today are the most common file formats for digital photos, and those are TIFF and JPEG, but we will also be discussing PDF files. And there's, of course, also lots of other files, GIFs and PDFAs and audio and video files and a plethora of other file formats. But for our use here for this webinar, we will mainly be discussing TIFFs and JPEGs and then touch briefly on PDFs. So before we head into learning about the different file formats, I just want to define a couple of terms. Part of the reason for the plethora of file types is this need for compression. Image files can be quite large, and larger file types mean more disk usage and slower downloads. So compression is a term used to describe ways of cutting the size of the file, allowing them to download faster and take up less space. Compression schemes can be either lossless or lossy. With lossless compression, the image preserves all of the file's original data, discarding no information. It basically looks for more efficient ways to represent an image while making no compromises in accuracy. This is common in TIFF images, which makes them much larger. With lossy compression, most of the data is discarded. There is some degradation in the image and data loss in order to achieve this smaller file size. But files can be reduced up to 1,000 times. And because of this, obviously some degree of quality is also lost. So, but this is also very common in JPEG images. And here is an example of lossless versus lossy compression. So the main difference between TIFFs and JPEGs then has to do with compression, which, as I just mentioned, is basically just squeezing down the digital data to make a smaller file. TIFFs are uncompressed. There are options when you're creating TIFFs, such as it'll give you choices, either no compression or uncompressed, or there's something else called the LZW, lossless compression routine, which just means that it will cut the size of the file in half without losing any digital data. And even though it does cut the file size in half, the files are still quite big. But when you have a large archive or collection, even a 50% reduction will reduce storage requirements and hopefully costs over time. JPEGs, on the other hand, compressed. So saving images as JPEGs employs a lossy compression, as we just talked about. A JPEG file loses some of the digital data captured by the scanner. But the good news is you can choose JPEG quality levels from maximum to lowest quality. So when you're asked to save a JPEG, it will always pop up a window that asks you, it'll give you a range from 1 to 10, whether you want maximum quality or the lowest quality, depending on your needs. So I want to talk about the advantages and disadvantages of using TIFFs versus JPEGs. So let's start with TIFFs, which stands for Tagged Image File Format. They are popular among users and have gained recognition in the graphic design arena. TIFFs are the format of choice for long-term archiving, as they do not compress to make smaller files since they're meant to preserve quality. They have a lossless compression, as mentioned. This also makes it the best option for printing and editing, and they're very easy to use with software that deals with page layout, publishing, and photo manipulation. They can be saved with layers, which is good for editing purposes or if you need to re-edit the file later. It's a very high quality image format and supported by many imaging programs. It can be used for files up to a bit depth of 64 and can be tagged with basic metadata. The disadvantages: very large file size, so you cannot use them online. They have a long transfer time. They take up a large amount of disk space or storage space and a very slow loading time. JPEG is short for Joint Photographic Experts Group, and it's the most popular among the image formats used on the web. So it's the most used and widely accepted format. It is the standard for web display since the file is smaller. It takes up less room and requires less time to transfer to site, so the loading time is faster and can achieve considerable size reductions. It can be used for files up to 24-bit and support a full spectrum of up to 16 million colors. Disadvantages: they are low quality. They lose quality with their high degree of compression, so they are lossy. Much information is lost from the original when you save it this way. This becomes a lot more evident if they're edited or resized, so they're usually not a good choice for editing or printing. And they are definitely not a good choice for archiving images. JPEGs should never be seen as the format of choice for digital masters, but as a great choice for web delivery. Due to this reduction of their quality, they should not be used for long-term preservation. And just as an aside, there's also what's called the JPEG 2000, which is a bit contested in the cultural heritage community. Some want to start using it for master files as they take up a little bit less space and can reduce storage costs. But they're still a lot better quality than a traditional JPEG, but TIFF is still the recommended format. And here is just an example of JPEG compression on various levels. So as you see, as you keep compressing the image, you lose more and more data left to right. PDF. You've probably all used or received PDFs at some point. It stands for Portable Document Format, and it was developed by Adobe. A PDF captures the printed intent of a document. The advantage against other formats is that you can be sure that anyone will view the file exactly as you want on another computer system. PDF files are very small and the content can be stored compressed. The free Adobe Reader is widely available and on almost all computer systems able to be read. But even though this file is compressed, it's still a great way to view and print images at a high resolution. So for instance, if you wanted to send some high resolutions off to a printer, like send via email, you could make PDF files off of the TIFFs that you created so that they get the best quality images. And these, once they're emailed, they can be emailed because they're so small. But keep in mind, PDFs are not in lieu of TIFFs. They are created from the TIFFs, but they're simply document files, so they cannot be edited the way TIFFs can. But it is a great tool if you need to send off high-resolution images and allow the recipient to see those images as they were originally intended, as far as high resolution. They are also a really good solution if you want to upload and distribute a document to the internet, because they're so much smaller. And there's also the PDF-A, which some institutions have been using more and more with the thought that they are better for long-term archiving over a traditional PDF. This is another thing still up for debate, but the PDFAs actually use embedded fonts versus in a regular PDF the fonts are just linked. So these PDFAs will be larger than your traditional PDFs because these fonts are actually embedded in the file. But it is supposed to guarantee reliable reproduction over time regardless of the application or system that was used to create the file, since those fonts are embedded and anyone that receives that file will see it exactly as you intended. Obviously with a PDF it's still as you intended, but the fonts may potentially change. The content will still be the same, but the fonts could be altered. A good rule of thumb is to scan your document or photo as a TIFF and then keep this as your master file. You can make copies of it for editing, as well as making JPEGs and PDFs of each file for easy storage and usability, but never edit your master file. One of the most important parts of digitization is the information that gets recorded in each file in a way that makes them easy to identify later on. So let's talk about metadata. This is not a simple conversation, and there are a lot of different metadata schemas, and I'm certainly not the expert on metadata, but I would like to give you some of the basics. At its most basic level, metadata is something that helps to better describe the data that you're trying to remember. So in other words, it's data about data. So it's information that tells you something about this digital image that you've saved. It's a way of tagging the internal digital information of the file and used to describe things like the type, the size, the purpose, the date or time, people, different places, etc. Metadata can be attached to any file so that searching by a keyword or a tag can help you locate the digital record later on. There are three main types of metadata: descriptive, structural, and administrative. And subsets of administrative would be rights management and preservation metadata. This link is from the Collaborative Digitization Program and another great resource. It provides guidelines for creating metadata records for digitized cultural heritage resources. So that's a good one. So let's talk about the different types. Descriptive metadata describes an object, and it includes items such as the keyword, an author, the title, the dimensions, what type of media, etc. This information is really helpful for creating finding aids. Important decisions you'll need to make. What information do your users need? What categories or browse functions should you consider? And what will help the audience when searching? This will all help you determine what types of metadata you can enter, what types of descriptive metadata to enter. Structural metadata pinpoints the relationships between objects. So for instance, you could say something like insert number 1 was attached to journal or diary number 5. It's basically what ties everything together. It's the internal structure, such as the order of pages in a chapter or individual diary entries in a diary section of a book. It may also include page numbering or table of contents. Administrative metadata. Information for managing resources, such as the file type, when and how it was created, or any technical information such as the hardware and software used to create that image. This is also referred to as technical metadata. Two important subsets of this metadata: rights management, metadata that deals specifically with intellectual property rights and copyright, and preservation metadata, information about archiving and managing preservation activities. Tracks preservation activities throughout the life cycle of a digital object and records actions taken to preserve that content, and both the analog and digital forms of the objects, not just the digital form. It's important to develop a style guide, make the metadata consistent, have quality control. Determine the workflow. Who will enter the metadata and how will it be entered and approved? This is just a list of some of the more common fields for entering metadata, and there are many other fields, but your author or creator, the copyright, credit, a caption or a description of the item, keywords, the title or the object name, location-related fields such as your city, the state, the country code, could be a continent, the date created, the date updated, and the original file name. Again, just to name a few. Next, I want to talk about hardware, software, and actual preparation for scanning or digitizing. The equipment used and its performance has an important impact on the quality of the image you produce. You should choose equipment that will be suitable for the materials that you are digitizing. What scanner is right for your project depends on the format, size, and condition of your materials. For materials for which people will want to study minute details of an object, high-resolution digital cameras are often recommended. For documents and photograph collections, flatbed scanners are well suited. Special book scanners or cradles can also be used for a wide range of printed and bound books. And consider choosing a scanning system that provides the best digital images possible within the limitations of your resources or budget. Here are some types of scanners. I'll go a little more in-depth detail about each, not too much, but a flatbed is suitable for paper, flat photographs, and printed materials. Note that the size of the scan area and note the size of your scan area and make sure that your materials will fit. Most consumer models have a scan area of 8.5 by 11, but there are many models that have a bigger scanning area that you can purchase. Slide scanners, slide and film scanners digitize transparent materials such as slides and film. And some flatbed scanners also have the capabilities to scan slides and film. So you can look for scanners that do both. Open book scanners are designed to digitize books without any damage to the original, which is frequently caused from flattening the book on a flatbed. But just note these can be pretty expensive. Drum scanners, also expensive and mostly used by press and graphics communities working with contemporary materials. So these are not recommended for cultural heritage materials. Often the materials are affixed to a drum that will rotate at a high speed around a sensor. So use with caution. Wide format scanners are designed to digitize large format materials like blueprints or maps. Again, these materials are drawn over the scanning sensors using drums, so there is danger of damage, perhaps rips or tears. So again, not recommended for cultural heritage materials. Basically, you don't want to put anything in there that you're not prepared to lose or find some damage. And then we've got digital cameras. Large format materials such as maps, posters, or 3D objects and artwork can require a digital camera. A lot of digital cameras do not have the capacity to create sufficient resolution for preservation capture. However, professional level cameras do produce very high quality images. They're very expensive. Ultimately, the right choice for you will depend on your project, your goal, and the materials within your budget. So try to think ahead and be flexible. In general, the flatbed with a large scanning area is relatively inexpensive and flexible for a wide variety of materials. But if you are only scanning books, for instance, you may need to rethink your choice. Just some scanners here, just different types. Large format book scanners. There are so many out there, so many different types of scanners, and within a wide range of budgets. So let's talk about software now. There's scanner software, and this is the software that controls your scanner and passes information to computer storage or an image editing software. and most scanners will come with this built in. Higher end scanners will come with software that allows the user to manually adjust the scanner settings, which is very important. Scanner software must be able to output image files in the appropriate file format, as we discussed earlier. You need to be able to make sure that your scanning software will allow you to output it to a TIFF. There's also image editing software, and this software allows you to manipulate images and then create derivative image file formats. Photoshop is one of the standard image editing softwares out there, and I'm sure you've all heard of Photoshop. The issue is it will require staff training and future upgrades, and you need to make sure that your computer has the minimum requirements of the software. So if you are interested in getting something like that, you'll just have to make sure that you have the capability at your institution. And also, some scanning software will allow a certain amount of image manipulation capability. So depending on what type of scanner you get, they will have, minimal to moderate image manipulation capabilities. And then there's digital asset management software. Digital projects can result in a large number of files that will need to be managed. So there is software available that provides sort of a quote-unquote out-of-the-box solution for the creation of workflow management. So you will need some type of digital asset management on site, but we'll talk about this next here. So you can think of a digital asset management system as the hub where your assets live, where you can move them around and work with them. They basically create a centralized area for you to access your assets. They're a centralized repository of media files that are stored in a database, and it's basically just one container that manages everything about the object. I know I've just said that in like several ways the same, but it basically is that. It's just this one chunk that holds all of your items. So digital asset management specifically refers to how you take in, handle, and distribute everything you have in digital form, anything from digital images to word processing documents. But it can also refer to the protocols and tasks around ingest, storage, archiving, and distribution of assets. The DAM system will also provide an infrastructure for preserving and managing your assets with search capabilities to help users identify and retrieve the ones that are relevant to their needs. These are a few examples of digital asset managers: Luna Insight, Content DM, and Islandora. And these are just a few out there. There are hundreds. So you may have heard of at least one or two of these, or know someone else or another institution that is incorporating this into their institution. There's also what is called content management systems. A CMS enables the management of different types of web content. So it's a computer application used to create, edit, manage, and publish content in a consistently organized fashion. And it basically helps users with no technical knowledge how to easily create, edit, manage the content that is delivered onto the web. So it basically manages information about the object and its associated metadata. CMS systems attach images for the web, but they do not necessarily manage or keep track of your assets like a digital asset manager does. But you may even have both at your institution, or some institutions do. The CMS will pull data from and information from your digital asset manager in order to put things onto your website. I think what ends up happening, though, is the lines between a DAM and a CMS are somewhat blurred. But basically, the DAM systems are focused on managing large collections of high-resolution digital images and videos, while a CMS is focused on mainstream web content. It's basically the back end of your website and allows someone to go in and do updates. And some CMSs do provide a type of DAM also built in. So again, there are many types of these DAMs and CMSs out there from a wide variety of costs. So it's something worth looking into. So I included a few slides on basics of preparation for digitizing and scanning documents or photos. And some of this may almost sound too basic, but you'd really be surprised as to what people will do. So it's important to prepare your documents for scanning. Assess the condition of the materials to ensure documents are not too fragile for scanning. As well as general fragility, you also want to look for things such as mold, pages stuck together, any inserts obscuring records, or any damage which has affected the legibility of the text. Remember that list I showed you earlier, materials you may wish to avoid digitizing. You want to remove any staples or pins or paper clips or any other hardware. Use both hands at all times when moving boxes and documents. Ensure the scanning beds are large enough to support the whole document. Never leave documents exposed on the scanner when unattended. Support books and other bound documents with a book cradle or book wedges if needed. Turn pages from the foredge or the right edge of a document rather than from the tail or bottom edge. It is not acceptable to use moisture for page turning, and this includes licking your fingers to flip a page. Do not pinch document corners together to turn the page. The scanning operator should unfold folded corners but should not refold them back onto themselves when they're done. Just leave them open. Where documents are attached to each other and cannot be separated, try to scan the document in a way which prevents the introduction of new creases, if you can help it. Take care with applied and pendant seals, as they are extremely fragile. They must not be knocked or have weight or pressure applied to them. Neither should they be left to hang off the edge of a workstation. Do not use glass on a seal without adjustments approved by a conservator. You should keep the documents in order. The contents of boxes should stay together and stay in the same sequence in which they came from the box. Work on only one document at a time so that boxes and documents do not get mixed up. Replace documents in closed boxes at the end of the day and return them to storage or wherever else you are housing them. Annotation or labeling of any part of the document should be avoided. Do not use sticky notes or post-it notes to mark your documents. Nothing with adhesive. You can use paper strips or paper markers, but just remember to remove the paper from the document after scanning. Scanning workstations should provide adequate surface area to ensure the full support of documents and allow for an organized workspace. Too little space can have a negative impact on document handling. So keep the scanning area clean and tidy. Keep bags and coats in lockers and do not take them into the scanning area. You want to keep the workspace free of food or drink, and that includes chewing gum. You should use pencils only, no ink, no felt tip pens or markers, no colored pencils or crayons. You get what I mean. You should not use hand or face moisturizers or moisturizing wipes or lip balms or anything similar that is applied by hand. Hands should be clean and dry at all times when handling documents. You should not wear cotton gloves or powdered gloves. They can often get caught on fragile documents. You can wear unpowdered nitrile or latex or similar to latex type of gloves if instructed specifically by a conservator, or for example, if you're using it for photographic material, but many times you do not need to wear gloves at all. Do not use handling aids such as rubber thimbles and other tools unless approved by a conservator. And what I mean by should never use gloves at all, or most of the time, is it just means you need to keep your hands clean at all times, and then you will not need to cover them up and risk damaging anything. Do not use cleaning liquids unless approved by the conservator. And if any damage to the documents or photos are found during scanning, bring this to the attention of the conservator or project manager for repair before scanning takes place. So when determining any digitization plan, you will need to decide if you are going to digitize in-house or outsource it. You can also ask yourself, will this be a one-time project? Or is your institution interested in committing to ongoing digitization efforts? So will you need special equipment? There are pros and cons to both, so I'm going to take a look at that. Establishing an in-house facility requires an institution to support the full digitization chain with appropriate staff, space, and facilities, equipment, supplies, and to absorb time and expenses associated with ramping up. So let's go over the advantages of using an in-house approach. Well, you'll learn by doing or learn as you go. So this will allow your staff and your organization to develop experience. You'll retain direct control over an entire range of imaging functions and the entire process. You provide your own, for security, proper handling and accessibility to materials. You can prioritize your library or archives requirements and maintain consistent and high quality assurance requirements. Some disadvantages of in-house: it can be a large investment in equipment and staff. There's usually no set per image cost. The institution pays for expenses instead of products, including costs of downtime, training, and technology obsolescence. There may be limited production capabilities and facilities. There's a range of staffing expertise required, and a knowledge of best practices can be daunting. So let's take a look at some of the advantages of outsourcing. There's cost containment and limited risk. The institution will pay for deliverables, and again, that's usually a set price per image, which helps facilitate the project planning and budgeting. Costs are typically lower than in-house figures, since you're only paying for production and you're not paying for equipment or staffing. Often vendors can handle large volumes of materials. Vendors will pay expenses, like expertise or training or technologically obsolescence costs absorbed. They'll deal with that versus you having to. A broad range of options and services may be available by using a vendor, including imaging, metadata creation, enhancements, processing, derivative creation, maybe printing, storage, backup, database development. It can go on and on. The disadvantages, though, your institution would then be one step removed from the process. You'd have less control over the process or quality. Services are most often performed off-site with the vendor or perhaps even offshore. The vendor may lack experience with the needs of cultural institutions. The lack of standards and best practices with which to define requirements or negotiate for services. Challenges in communication from RFP development to contracting to production and quality requirements. And there could be security or handling or transportation issues involved. But ultimately both are viable options. Make the choice as early as possible, as this decision will affect everything, including planning and budgeting. This is especially true if you are writing a grant. So it's imperative that you make sure that the files can be easily identified, organized, accessed, and maintained long-term. We'll talk a bit about storage, file naming protocols, and maintenance and backups in this last section. Records, whether they're personal, professional, academic, are a fundamental part of our life. Keeping track of and maintaining all of these important documents is just not simple. Who hasn't been searching for a file and cannot find it no matter what they do? it is very important that you establish some kind of file management in order to keep proper records. Otherwise, your computer could end up looking something like this, which we've all seen or done, maybe some of us. Consider how important it is to keep, store, maintain, find, retrieve all of these records when you need them. Information and records have always been a primary source of any institution. We cannot function without them. Businesses operate based on these records. Some files may need to be edited and thereby creating multiple versions, which may end up being distributed among different people or employees or even third parties such as customers or vendors. So all of these versions need to be tracked so that a specific version can be found when it's needed. So it's important to track the derivatives. And these days, businesses are creating and receiving records at such an escalating rate, not only in huge volume, but the records come in a variety of formats, digital images, either ones received from outside or a scanned image, emails, word processing documents, and then these documents also exist in multiple storage media, like backup drives or CDs or DVDs or flash drives or local or network hard drives. So, and the cloud, they can also exist on the cloud. So with all of these options, proper organization of archives or your personal records, it's crucial for good file management. Many institutions with a lack of policies or procedures for managing these files can face problems and risks. They may keep some records for too long or waste time looking for information, fail to abide by record-keeping rules or regulations, and potentially fail to safeguard vital information. So it's very important. With almost all new information now being created in digital form or getting digitized, it is becoming increasingly important to manage and organize them, and we all need a system where you can locate files quickly and easily so that you can access them from anywhere when needed, as well as being able to access them on the computer or on the cloud. It's good to be able to restrict access to authorized users only, so there's added security. Digital files can be saved in secured environments using a server or encryption. You can store the documents for both short and long-term use, and you can keep a safe copy to avoid disaster. With digitizing large collections, since only the digital version is being used on a regular basis, the original analog version or document can be safely stored away and protected from the day-to-day access and common disasters. Next, I just want to talk about how to organize your digital files, whether for personal or business use. And again, some of this may seem obvious, but the task of organizing digital files can be intimidating with the thought of combining hundreds or even thousands of files, ones that you haven't even looked at in decades. But once you have a system established, you'll be able to drag and drop files and complete the project fairly quickly. There are two types of files on your computer, the ones you make and the ones you collect, and you will choose what these files are called and where they are stored. The main thing to remember is when you're organizing or renaming files is to just be descriptive, but keep it simple. The goal is to come up with a structure that is easy for you to remember and follow. You don't want to make it too long and complicated. You also want to be consistent. Once you develop a technique as to how you want to label things, you should use this all the time. And file management software. This can refer simply to images on your server or creating your own image database for organizing files or for a digital asset manager like we talked about earlier. Next, I want to address naming the digital files themselves. So once your photos and documents are grouped into folders or subfolders or however you've organized them, you should try to standardize the names of the photos and documents themselves. It's really helpful for sorting later. You should use standard file extensions so that anyone can open the file. Names should be short and simple. Each name should cover the basics, capturing some of the who, what, when, where, and why. Make sure you add enough information so that it's organized and easy to understand. Some other tips, just It's a great idea to start with the year or the date, and then include some kind of descriptive text such as the company name or the job name or number or the client name. You should avoid using spaces or special characters because some software will not read those, but you can include an underscore. Like I've shown here in the example, those are readable. So this is just, like I said, an example. There are many other ways you can name files. This is just one way. It has a lot of information without being overly lengthy, but it's very descriptive. Many photo or digital camera programs will let you automatically name a save file as you create them rather than just assigning them a number, but you can also go back later and rename files for more detail and accuracy. Keep in mind that your photos or documents may one day become separated from the folder you're putting them in, so it is a good idea to include enough information in the file, in the name, to identify it later without having the folder. And here are a couple of excellent resources for more information on best practices for file naming. The last but maybe the most important aspect of file managing is backing up your files. Without a proper backup, you can lose everything. A single computer failure can wipe out your entire collection if it is not properly backed up. Or one mistake in editing your file can cause you to overwrite the original, causing the original impossible to recover. A disaster could happen, such as a flood or fire, which could wipe out the collection if it is not properly archived and in a safe space. So, the main thing to remember is the 3-2-1 rule. To lower your risk of data loss, it's imperative that you have 3 copies, at least 3 copies of your important data, ideally in 3 locations. So the 3-2-1 rule, at least 3 copies, and these should be kept in different places on at least 2 different formats with 1 copy off-site minimum. So this is all based on redundancy. Remember, the 3rd and 2nd copies should be kept in different locations. So you can keep one on hand in case you need quick recovery, and then the other should be kept off-site where it is not subject to the same threats. You have a lot of options when it comes to making backups of your files. Some examples would be keeping the original on your computer hard drive or server, and then your 2nd and 3rd backups could be stored on different external hard drives. You can even have a 4th backup or one of those backups be with an online storage company or use the cloud. And the cloud is becoming more and more common for backing up and archiving files. But just remember, you will also need to make sure you have a backup of the cloud. The more regularly you can back up, the better. Weekly is best. Just FYI, CDs and USB drives are not good for long-term storage. The media is too prone to failure or deterioration. I know a lot of people have things on CDs and USBs, but these are very unpredictable and not safe. Digital files are becoming just as precious and fragile as our original mementos, so preserving them is critical. Digitization is the final step in processing our collections. It provides a use copy so that originals can be stored and used infrequently, limiting handling of the original, which may be brittle or damaged. This technology provides the benefit of enhancing retrieval and access. Once you've determined how you can implement a digitization project at your institution, you should create an informed workflow. Find out what best meets the mission of your organization. Focus on goals and objectives. Consider your users and audience. Prioritize your collections. Implement best practices and industry standards. Properly manage your assets. And of course, back everything up. The most important thing we will learn today: back up, back up, back up. So that is it. That is my presentation. I hope that you all enjoyed it, and please let me know. This is a time for questions. It's 3:17, so we have until about 3:30. So if anyone has questions, I see people typing, so good. A strip of paper, not a paper clip. So if you have a book, for instance, or if you have a pile of papers, Sylvia, literally just a strip like a marker of paper, but definitely not a paper clip. You don't want to add another crink in the paper that you're in your object. So no paper clips, no. Great. Yes, we will be sending you the presentation later, and Diani is answering that question as we speak under the name Asia Davis, as we talked about. So keep a look for that. You're welcome. I know it's a lot of information in an hour and 15 minutes. So thanks for bearing with me. Any other questions? Oh, I don't actually see you typing anymore. Oh. Okay. Okay, so Diani just responded back that you can see that we won't be emailing you a copy, but a recorded version will be on our website for you to access. Anyone can hear it. If there is a corner detached from the rest, is there a way to reattach? Well, that's a question for a conservator. There definitely is a way to reattach, but that's not something I would recommend you do yourself, but speak to a conservator. Reattaching a corner is not, the hardest thing in the world, but it is definitely something where you would need to use the proper tools in order to do so, the proper adhesive and the proper mending material, Mark. So I would definitely talk to you or whoever is managing the project, or if it's you, speak to a conservator. Sure. Okay. Perry asks, how long will the recorded version be available on the website? I would like to provide the link for a class I teach in the future. Diani is responding. You're welcome, Mark. The metadata template field slide, what, I'm sorry, I'm not sure I understand the question. Can you share with me where the metadata template field slide was found? Author date. You mean the slide in this presentation? I'm not really sure what you mean as far as, you mean what number slide it is in this presentation, or? Oh. Oh, I'm sorry. Give me 1 second, Kathy. Sorry about that. Let's see. So, I mean, that was, oh, okay, I'm sorry. I just wanted to look at the slide to make sure. That was just some common fields that I retrieved. That wasn't taken from anywhere in particular. There's not a link to another site to see that, but if you want to send me an email, which is listed here on the questions page, I will certainly send you a couple of links to something more specific for metadata. But please send me an email, and I'd be happy to do that. Okay, let's see. And so, Perry, I assume you saw the response that it should be up indefinitely. Let's see. Mary asks, okay, great, Perry. Yes, Mary, those would be sometimes most in need of preservation, but sometimes it depends on the item. If it's so brittle that even lifting it up and putting it on the scanning bed will cause it to disintegrate more, or if you've got iron gall ink that is literally eating through the page, that anytime you move it, the little black ashy ink will just fall off, then that is something you would want to speak with a conservator about, as far as making sure that that media is stable enough to actually use. But yes, definitely, if you're able to do it, the ones that are most fragile often are the most in need of digitization, but you just have to be careful so that you don't damage anything further. Or you just take that risk and you assume that responsibility for that, if it's okay with you, with your institution. I hope that helps, Mary. Considering Content DM, yes, a lot of people do use Content DM. I'm not pro or con any of them, just to put that out there. I know they all have their advantages and disadvantages, so I know that Content DM is used by a lot of people, so you can probably talk to other institutions in your area who are using it, because so many people do use it. So I think it's a good place to start. Yeah, you're welcome, Mary. And again, just to add on to the question from Mary Johnson, um, items, again, items such as books that have red rot. I don't know if you've ever seen that, where the leather is literally deteriorating and it's literally crumbling and it's bright red. That's something that can often be taken care of by a conservator. They basically consolidate the leather. And it's, again, it probably would incur a cost unless you had a conservator at your institution, but it isn't a difficult thing to do. So if you had something like that, you may want to consolidate that red rot before you put it on the scanner, because not only every time you move that book, the rot will crumble, but then it's going to get all over your scanning bed, and then each time you have to scan, you're going to be wiping it down. So I think that you just need to, it's on a case-by-case basis, but that list is really, it's good to have, just to keep in mind certain things that you may want to reach out to a conservator about, or your project manager, or whoever it is at your institution that you need to talk to. So I hope that helps. Okay. See if I don't think I missed any questions. Are there any other questions? Any other questions? I guess there are no other questions, so I'll just say thank you so much. Oh, another question, sorry. Digitization as a potential space saver. Um, yes, what I mean by that is, I mean, basically as you're as you're incurring more and more records as time goes on, you're gathering more and more paper records, and the sooner you can digitize those and keep those on site, the digitized records, you can store away some of these paper records. So what I mean is it's not like you're not going to incur any new paper records, but you can keep things on hand that are a little more pressing. But some institutions have records, dating back to, the 40s, and they've got, rooms filled in their current spaces where they're working of these types of documents. It's good to find a storage space if you have that kind of an excess in material. So that's what I meant by that. Does that make sense? It's also, if you need to refer to an item, again, that's from 1950 and you've digitized it, you certainly may not have that item from 1950 just sitting next to your desk, but you will have the digital file next to your desk. So as far as space, just keeping the relevant material at your fingertips, basically. And as time goes on, more and more people are creating born digital records and not creating paper records at all. So that, again, in the future is going to lessen the amount of paper we have out there. It's currently very, it's happening as we speak. Okay, good, good. And some people actually, not that I propose this, some people do actually get rid of some of that old material, especially if they have 3 or 4 or 5 copies of the same document. So again, that's something else that's your institution would have to determine whether or not, keeping 5 copies of the same record is worth it. Okay, great. Any other questions? Okay, well, it's 3:30. I think that concludes it. Again, if anyone has anything specific they'd like to ask me, please email me at ttalansky@ccaaha.org, as you see on the screen, and I'm happy to answer your questions outside of this. So thank you for attending and registering, and I hope you all have a great day. Take care.